Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us today. This is the second edition of Discourse inaugural seminar series, and I'm Lena Palaniappan. I'm going to spend a few minutes giving some introduction about the seminar series and also introduce the speakers today. Before I start, I want to let everyone know this meeting is being recorded and it will go live. Not live, sorry, it will go recorded on YouTube. It will be hosted after the meeting is done. So please make sure we're all in our best behaviors for the recorded meeting. The idea today is we're going to have 2 hours of scholarly discussion, and it starts with a presentation by 2 speakers together, one at a time, and then we have a discussant. We'll have the speaking session for the first hour, and then we'll have detailed discussion about the issues that arises from the talk, also from the area computational linguistics in general for the next hour. So we hope to finish 2 hours from now. So for people who are joining us for the first time, a brief introduction to Discourse. Discourse is a diverse international scientific consortium for thought, language, and communication research in psychosis. It's a group, it's a network of people who came together, who are all interested in studying these phenomena, the language phenomena in psychosis. And we currently have 103 members registered, interested members registered in this network. This is the steering group of this network. It's a small group of people who made this inaugural seminar series possible, and also working behind the screens to bring you what the Discourse brings to you. Emre Bora, he's in Turkey. Eric Tan from Australia. Gina Cooperberg from Boston. Iris Sommer from Netherlands. And Lena Palaniappan, that's myself. I work in Western University in Canada. And Maria Alonso, she works at the Western University, Canada, as well as in University of Valparaiso in Chile. Natalia Mota, who's going to be one of the discussants today, and she works in Brazil. And Wolfram Hinzen, who works in Barcelona in Spain. So the series itself has 5 talks, and today you are at the second talk. We had a very exciting, interesting talk last month from Peter Liddell and Peter McKenna. The recording of the talk is available. I sent it on the email. If any of you haven't received it, please let me know. Happy to send it to you again. We also will be putting that link up on the Discourse website. All the talks will be linked eventually on the Discourse website. And today is September 24. We had 3 more talks after today's talk. Please note these dates. They're all free for everyone, and everybody can watch it after the events as well. So this is today's structure. We'll have 45 to 50 minutes of talk, and then 15 minutes led by the discussant. The discussant will try to summarize the issues brought in by the speakers, and they will also try to be provocative, so we can raise some issues that are important for the field to move forward. One of the important goals of this seminar series is to identify people who are working in this area, also identify interests that people share, so we can put together small working groups in the future as part of Discourse initiative. The discussion is open, anybody can join, but when the speaker is talking, please put your questions on the chat box. Myself and Maria will moderate it, and we will call you out after the discussant finishes their session. You can either let us read the question if you want, or if you want to speak yourself, we can call you and you can speak. Until your call, please mute your phones, mute your microphones if possible, so that there's no disruption to the speaker. As I said, the event is being recorded. So we have 3 exciting speakers and discussants today, and we start with Cheryl Corcoran. Many of you know Cheryl. She is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Medical School. She has a master's in biostatistics. She currently works as an associate professor and a leader in psychosis risk at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. She has more than 25 years of experience in studying the clinical high-risk phenomena in psychosis. And this experience includes studying the natural language processing, sensory processing, social cognition, neuroimaging, clinical correlates, cannabis and stress exposures, the nosology of clinical high risk, ethics, stigma, clinical trials, as well as services. She has a very broad and encompassing experience and expertise in this area. Cheryl is also a pioneer in applications of artificial intelligence for computational phenotyping. That includes analysis of the semantic and syntactic structure of language across various stages of schizophrenia, including the risk state. And she's going to present some of it today for this meeting. She holds several federal NIMH grants to study both neural correlates of language impairment and the generalizability of these deficits to cohorts worldwide. Cheryl will join us in a few minutes. We also have Guillermo Cecchi, who is the second speaker. He'll be starting the session today. He is a graduate of physics from Argentina. He did his graduate degree, doctoral degree in physics and biology at the Rockefeller. And then he did a postdoctoral fellowship in neuroimaging in psychiatry at Cornell. He has an experience in diverse aspects of broad neuroscience and behavior research that includes theoretical biology, including Brownian transport, molecular computation, studying the spike reliability of neurons, song production, statistics of natural images, visual perception, statistics of natural language, which is what he'll be talking about today, and brain imaging as well. So since 2001, he's working as part of the IBM research and working on computational approaches to brain function. Guillermo pioneered the use of computational linguistics to quantify many psychiatric conditions from short speech samples. He's applied it to schizophrenia, to mania, prodromal psychosis, drug and alcohol use, and also chronic pain. He directs the Computational Psychiatry and Neuroimaging Group in the IBM Watson Laboratory and is worldwide strategy lead for digital health interventions at the IBM. So me being me had difficulties in pronouncing names. Everybody has difficulty pronouncing my name, but I had difficulty in getting Guillermo's name right. So when I asked him how to get it right, he gave me 3 images. Remember the guitar, Guy, that's how it starts. When you say Guillermo, then you say Cecchi, che for chess, and then he is emphasized like you emphasize pizza, so Cecchi. I'm going to remember these 3 colorful things, Guillermo, every time I introduce you. Thanks for letting me have this fun. And then we have Natalia. This is Natalia, and Natalia's junior. She will be our discussant today. Natalia is a computational psychiatrist and a neuroscientist at UFRN, the Universidad Federal do Rio Grande do Norte in Brazil. She has a bachelor's in medicine, and she did her residency in psychiatry and postdoctorate work in neuroscience and PhD in neuroscience. She is a pioneer in the field of computational psychiatry. She developed a method based on graph-based analysis of speech samples, which nicely complements some of the other work that's going to be discussed today. She's currently investigating how narrative markers derived from speech graphs especially, typically develop in children. She's a very influential researcher in Brazil and worldwide. She's been pointed by Forbes magazine as one of the 20 most powerful women in Brazil in 2020. And she's the first Brazilian scientist to be shortlisted by the prestigious scientific journal Nature as an inspiring scientist in 2019. So we have a very much a power-packed speaker list today for you. With this introduction, I don't want to stand further in between you and the speakers. I'm going to take this off the screen. Please remember again, this is recorded, and please be on mute until your call. Thank you very much. You are on now, Guillermo.
Thanks, Elena, for the introduction and for the invitation. Can you see the presentation? Well, perfect. So, so besides Cheryl, who had difficulties getting to the lab, and she will join us later, we also have Agrima Srivastava. She's been working with us. She comes from artificial intelligence and natural language processing, and she made a fast transition, and her contributions are reflected in the presentation, and I'll call her out at some point to explain some of the results. This is also part of a collaboration with a large consortium that includes colleagues in Canada, Romina Mizrahi, and in Australia, Barnaby Nelson, and also Philip Wolf at Emory. So the topic of this discussion of the results that we'll show is metaphoricity. Metaphoricity in psychosis, in the language produced by patients at clinical high risk and also patients who are already converted. So, why metaphoricity? And what do we mean by metaphoricity? So first of all, what is metaphor? So if we go, as usual, the best way to think about this is to go back to the Greeks. The idea of a metaphor is a language device that carries meaning across, right? So that's the most basic understanding of what a metaphor is. You take meaning from somewhere and you carry it over somewhere else. Now, the difficulty here is that if you think about metaphor, there are many similar language devices that can be compared, that sometimes are very difficult to separate from metaphor, and they can be broadly considered figurative speech. Oh, we have Cheryl with us. That's good. But we'll focus on a particular way of thinking about metaphor that is constrained, but it will be illustrative of what we are thinking and what the other people who studied metaphors in psychosis have been thinking. The other thing that is important to note is how broad, how extended metaphor use is, right? So if you just go to Google and type mouse, that's what you get. You get already a metaphor, and the metaphor is, the mouse. Oh, where is it here? Right, your computer mouse and the animal, and it's very pervasive, right? It's really very pervasive, and to the point that as using a metaphor that might not be apt, there's more than meets the eye when it comes to metaphor, to the point that at least in philosophy, and going back to Nietzsche, who's a favorite of mine, pointed out that pretty much everything we do in language is a metaphor, right? So he claims that all we do is produce metaphors when we speak. But before and after Nietzsche, artists knew this all along, right? So metaphor in literature and beyond literature, but in particular in literature, it's a device that's been with us since the inception of literature. And I recommend for anyone interested the most recent book by Haruki Murakami, where the protagonist, the main character of the novel, is a metaphor. And he has very interesting observations that eventually we would like to explore. And that is the idea that what defines a metaphor is the path of the metaphor. And each one of us follow a different path when we produce and when we hear a metaphor, and that's what defines the metaphor. So it's very deep, but as far as I know, on the science side, we have not come to that conclusion yet. We don't have tools to analyze that. Now, this is where I would like to pass the baton to Cheryl, because at this point we want to get closer to how we are thinking about metaphors in psychosis.
Hi, everybody. We're swimming in metaphors today. Swimming is a spatial metaphor, and Guillermo has passed me the baton, yet another metaphor. And I want to apologize for being late. My car battery was, dead, which is yet another metaphor. And here on the wonderful streets of Manhattan, gosh, about 5 or 6 men, not a metaphor, all came together to jump my car. So my car sprung back into life after the battery was dead. And so I have always thought of metaphor as relevant to when I studied English or when I read books. And thank you to Guillermo and a number of other people, but especially Guillermo. I have been persuaded that, and I hope that we persuade you as well, that metaphors are really part and parcel of language and how we speak and communicate, but also how we think of ourselves in the world. And so I would recommend this book by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And I think this is a newer, prettier version than the one that you see up on the left, Metaphors We Live By. It's a very easy read. And for me, it was really remarkable to read because just everything, space, time, time is money. And, time is, we'll talk about culture later, but the idea of time is money is a particularly Western concept, but one that we can waste time, we can spend time, we count time. So time really has this sort of metaphor of money. And as you hear this talk, I invite you all to think about all the different metaphors that we have. And so this is true, metaphors are just everywhere. And it can be challenging to think about, could we even think or talk if we didn't have metaphors? Time is coming ahead. There are lots of spatial metaphors. Even your mood, you feel up, that's spatial, or you feel down, that's spatial. So, and the kinds of metaphors that we'll be talking about in the analyses that we do are very much based on these thoughts from George Lakoff. And so one thing that I've learned with this is that things I don't even think of as metaphors are metaphors. So those sort of spatial representations, et cetera. I think of metaphors as, X is like B, my smile is like a flower, but metaphors actually are much more than that. May you advance the slide? Thank you. So there has been some study of metaphors and psychosis and schizophrenia. These are the cohorts that I have studied. And my colleague Guillermo and Agrima Shrivastava is studying metaphors in psychosis and schizophrenia. And this is a little bit about their history. So Andreasen, who I see is really one of the pioneers of studying language and in psychosis and schizophrenia, along with Gina Cooperberg and then Brita Elvevag. So Nancy Andreasen was among the first to kind of codify and operationalize some of the unusual figurative speech that she saw in people with schizophrenia. She wasn't the first, of course. Kreplin also noted the use of figurative language. So here, these were from the 70s, 80s, the idea these are actual phrases used by patients. One patient had called his watch a time vessel, which has, a certain beauty to it. And gloves called hand shoes. So these metaphors are very evocative and figurative. And then Billow, I'll talk about Billow's study, who actually has some empirical data and didn't just come up with examples. Billow, who apparently must have, I think, was working in New York, studied metaphor and evocative language among individuals with schizophrenia. And as an example of a metaphor, he said, do you feel like your body is rotting? And he said, I feel like the South Bronx. And, you know, the South Bronx, much better now, but in the 90s, everybody sort of knew what he meant. You know, this patient, when he said, I feel like the South Bronx, the South Bronx, you know, had lots of old abandoned buildings in stages of decay. This is another sort of beautiful and evocative metaphor that makes sense. It's a metaphor. And as an example of evocative language, and I'm sorry, this is sort of tailored to the Americans in the crowd, when asked when a patient was asked if he thought he had special powers, he said, I know from watching I Dream of Jeannie and my favorite Martian that I don't have special powers. So Billow would say this is not a metaphor because it didn't have like. People define metaphor in different ways, but you know, this is rather elaborate. And for, you know, those of you who watched I Dream of Jeannie and knew she would do this, and my favorite Martian who would travel around, you knew exactly what he meant here. And then we have been, as many of you know, doing open-ended interview with a lot of people who have psychosis, also healthy individuals, and people at clinical high risk. And so we collect some, you know, my research assistants have collected some interesting phrases and evocative figurative language that they've heard. And this one we thought was particularly good. Communication is like a watermelon. You have to break it up into pieces. It's kind of beautiful. You can sort of imagine, you can't just eat a watermelon whole to really, you know, get at the watermelon. You have to break it up into pieces. And this person was describing that communication is like that as well. Next slide, please. So there are two main empirical studies. Oh,
there you go.
There we go. So I mentioned Billow. Let me tell you a little bit about this study and, you know, some of the challenges it introduces, some of the limitations, some of the ideas. So for Billow, he studied 36 schizophrenia patients, 36 patients with borderline personality disorder, and 36 individuals who had a medical illness. And all 108 of these individuals were in the hospital. They were all men. There is nothing about their ethnicity. They're between the ages of 20 and 55. And the way that speech was elicited was, I think this was sort of the forebear of the forerunner of the SCID. It was a structured diagnostic interview that had items that were designed by Spitzer, the author and architect of the SCID, more metaphors, Gunderson, et cetera. And it was manual ratings, but you know, they had a manual, they checked inter-rater reliability. They really tried to do their best to study this. Now this, the idea of metaphor was not taken from Lakoff. It was, this idea of expressive language was from Polio, Barlow, Fine, and Polio. That should read 1977, 1077 would have been rather prescient on their part. So it was somebody who had come up with a rubric or heuristic 20 years earlier. And for expressive language, they defined 3 categories, one being metaphor. And for them, a metaphor had to have like or as, had to have the comparison. Evocative language included probably most of the other metaphors that Lakoff would describe, but those that were more, we would think of as more sort of figurative or expressive. And then the third category was idioms, or what he called dead metaphors. And this is, I ask you to keep this in mind when you hear about our data, because this question of metaphor and what's evocative and what's idiomatic, sort of what's creative and what is just, you know, boring speech, can be a little bit hard to tell apart. So, and here are some more examples. He looked at expressive language. That was his effort to look at metaphor. And then he also looked at bizarre or deviant language. And I want you to keep that in mind when you hear about our data as well. So he was interested in the production of metaphor and figurative language, but also language. And this came from Andreas and these three concepts from her thought language communication scale, was that phrases were also marked as bizarre, concrete, or tangential. And so an example of bizarre, which you can see is a little bit more than metaphor. And actually, the same sentences could be rated as figurative and as deviant. Here's an example. My Gemini girl, an attorney, took me to the hospital. It's very evocative, kind of bizarre. And the literal or concrete, when asked if their body was rotting, didn't cite the South Bronx, but said, no, I got a good x-ray, it's not rotting, which actually seems reasonable to me, but was tagged as literal or concrete. So in this study, their main conclusions were that and you know, the numbers are small, they did their best, but there were similar rates of metaphors as defined here with like. There were similar rates of idioms, the sort of dead metaphors. Schizophrenia patients were a little less evocative and more tangential and bizarre. And this was in comparison to the borderline patients and the patients with borderline personality disorder, and also the medical patients. And interestingly, you look at this paper, the patients with borderline personality disorder, for whatever reason, had rather high rates of using dead metaphors. So I want you to keep this heuristic in mind of sort of metaphor and bizarreness, because we'll use that, and also the conclusions here. The group differences, you know, kind of depends on who you're studying, but here they found the way that these were defined: metaphors and evocative language, those are two from the expressive, and tangential and bizarre, two from the deviant, all four of them highly intercorrelated with one another. Next slide, please. And then, of course, Brita Elvevag did a paper about metaphor, production, and comprehension. And I say, of course, because Brita has pretty much studied everything about language and psychosis, and I learned so much from her papers, even when I go back. And she tends to do things at least 5 to 10 years before everybody else. So here in this paper, she also looked at metaphor comprehension, I want to focus on metaphor production because that's what our data is, and in the interest of time. So Brita studied 21 patients, all schizophrenia. They were moderately ill. They had an IQ of 96. They were all on medication. And then there were 21 matched controls, and they were matched for age and education. And I looked through the paper, and I think I might not have access to the supplement, but I don't know if these were all men or if there was men and women. I just don't know. And with Brita's paper and also with Billow's paper, I think sort of consistent, there's not a report of ethnic or racial identity. In this paper, Brita really borrowed is not the right word, really sort of conceptualized how she measured metaphor from Lakoff, this book, Metaphors We Live By. And I thought, here again, she's very prescient. This is 2011. Metaphors are not simply linguistic devices, but are core components of reasoning and inferential processing, and are fundamental to how we organize and map our conceptual knowledge. And this is something that Guillermo and others have persuaded me of. So let me tell you a little bit about what she found. Well, first, the way that she elicited speech was free speech. And there were 6 emotions, and she would say the word, and then the person would describe a personal event in which they had that emotion. And so you see there, of the 21 patients, 7 of them used at least one metaphor in describing personal events for one of the 6 emotions. And among those who were healthier, they used 11, not statistically significant. I think this is more sort of illustrative. The emotions that tended, it was kind of spread out, but anger, fear, sadness, love. It seemed like fear in particular maybe had a few more metaphors, especially for patients, which we would not be surprised by. And also lust, a lot of the participants just declined talking about that. I guess for privacy or embarrassment. So what Brita found was that there was no difference in metaphor use. However, among the schizophrenia patients, it seemed that when they used metaphors, they were kind of inappropriate to context. So this is kind of like getting back at coherence. There was, and interestingly, although the schizophrenia patients had an equivalent production of metaphors for the comprehension part of this study, they did interpret metaphors somewhat more literally or concretely, which is a replicated finding in the literature. So Elvevag, Billow, those are the two studies. If people know about others that we missed, please let us know. I think the challenge in these studies was really the rating of metaphors, and which was manual in both. The definitions were a little bit different, but I think it raises a question, especially with metaphor being so fundamental to language. Can we automate and identify consistent metrics of metaphor? Because I just have one more slide before I hand it back. So I had mentioned being very inspired by Andreas and Kuperberg and also Elvevag. So in terms of language production, I really like the construct that Gina Kuperberg has, where language is, relies on both top-down and bottom-up processing, top-down processing being particularly important. With when any of us speak, as we're speaking, we have actually predictions of what we ourselves will say next. As we're speaking, as I'm speaking right now, there's some part of my brain that's monitoring, adjusting as I speak. If I look like I'm going to say something dopey, my brain kind of tries to bring me back. We do this, we monitor to make sure that words are, that we select are congruent, with what we want to convey. And this falls apart in schizophrenia to some extent, in some patients more than others. And this is really the work that Kuperberg has done, and has done some really beautiful cognitive science work using electrophysiology, both for comprehension and for production. She had a study looking at, I think, N400s before individuals produced speech, and people with schizophrenia didn't have the same kind of modulation that you would see in healthy individuals. Her model, based on her electrophysiological data and other data in the literature, posits that there's a reduction in the propagation of top-down predictions and an over-dependence on bottom-up processing. So this is like, as you're talking, you a little bit more sort of mired in what the words are, how they're saying it, and losing track a little bit of the meta that you're kind of following as you talk. There are large prediction errors. They trigger inappropriate shifts in message level representation. And so then what happens is that with the choice of words, it's kind of a larger group of words that are chosen from, and often they're a little bit less congruent with the overall message. And so words will be said that, if an individual was healthy, might have been corrected, or a different word chosen with more unusual words intruding. And I like the idea of this framework because as you hear about the results that we have, I think that this framework, and it would be interesting to hear about in the discussion, could very much be related to metaphor production, whether it's evocative metaphor, which is sort of choosing an unusual word and going down that path, or if you're losing your train of thought, that kind of reliance on idiom. So this is the background that I wanted to give. I now will pass it over to Guillermo and Agreement to tell you about the study. Thank you.
Oh, okay, sure. So let me say that we need to, I want to challenge that interpretation, because there are other ways to interpret that, but let's leave that for the discussion.
Okay.
I think there are other alternatives that are also interesting, might be compatible with results. Now, concretely, what is that we can do computationally? And as usual, when we do this, we have to constrain the interpretation of what we consider metaphor. So what we did, and this is following studies by linguists that include Lakoff, as Cheryl was saying. And the idea is that what defines a metaphor is the mismatch between the most primitive meaning of a word. So in isolation, without the context, and the meaning that is implied by the context, right? And this is a good example. Right? So when we say the attorney demolished the prosecution's arguments, there is a basic meaning of demolished that if you remove the context is perhaps the first thing that comes to mind. But in the context of the sentence, that demolished ceases to be the direct, simple implication of destroying something that's been constructed physically, and becomes metaphorical, right? So this particular sentence may, for a person in the street, may or may not be considered a metaphor, but the idea is that at the core, this is a metaphoric construction, and is determined by this mismatch between the context and the contextual and the nuclear meaning of a word. Right? That's the basic idea of the method. And this has been codified. It's called the metaphor criteria, and it's been codified along with a database that people have put together, and there are a few more now. But the idea is, again, this is the procedure. Just read the text, identify the lexical units, and establish the contextual meaning, as I was saying. And then if there is this mismatch between the local and the contextual meaning, then you mark this as a metaphor. The limitation of this is that, of course, it does not distinguish between a conventional metaphor, and Sherry was saying, filling down. Few people will immediately think of that as a metaphor because it just become conventional, right? It's a normal use of language, so it doesn't distinguish between that and a more abstract or unconventional metaphor. And this is, again, this is the value and the limitation of the metaphor criteria method. Like I said, this was developed along with a large corpus of consistent of a large number of texts in which sentences were labeled by hand by human raters following this procedure, as being metaphorical or non-metaphorical. At least the words being metaphorical or non-metaphorical, like here, right? So here, demolish will be considered metaphorical according to the procedure. And so this is something that we can use, and we used in order to train models, automated models, to identify metaphors. And a little bit of background, because this is an essential component of the models that we use. they rely on the idea of semantic embedding that probably you have heard, you have seen, because they are also everywhere. They're running in your smartphones, just scavenging for markers of your preference for Nike or Adidas in your emails and posts. And the idea is that the semantic embedding is a way of quantifying the meaning of a word, not in absolute terms, right? Not in isolation of the word, but contextually, in the sense that semantic embedding allows you to make comparisons between words, right? So and so you can compare the meaning of two words by establishing a distance. So words that are more similar to each other will be closer in an abstract space. Words that are very different from each other would be farther apart. So essentially, there's several and evolving methods allow you to assign a word to a vector, and then you do vector computation in order to, among other things, measure similarity. And this is based on the use. So the meaning, the idea is that the meaning of a word is how the word is used. So words that appear together more often have a more similar meaning to each other, right? And like I said, there is a cottage industry of such models that have been extended to also sentences themselves. So you can encode not just a word, but an entire sentence, and then compare sentences by comparing how similar the vectors are. So this is a tool that we use in our models. And based on that, so what we did was to take interviews, open-ended interviews that Cheryl can describe much better than me, that she conducted with patients and controls. And what we did was to develop a model based on the idea of the metaphor identification procedure I just described, training on the corpus. It's a complete independence of the corpus that University of Amsterdam put together, a network in which we take words, in this case, 3 words, consecutive words, assign the semantic vectors to each one of them, feed that into a network, and trying to learn based on the labels of that were produced, that were attached to the sentences in the corpus, infer whether the word in the middle is being used metaphorically or not, as in the case of attorney demolished prosecution, right? So we train a simple neural network using this semantic embeddings with the labels produced by human raters, and then apply that directly without retraining or doing anything else to the data from the interviews that Cheryl conducted with her patients. And what we saw in the initial paper with a relatively small cohort of around 30, 35 individuals, that there was in the schizophrenia population an increased production of metaphors as measured by this particular method, right? The metaphor identification procedure, with all the limitations that it has. So we saw that there was a difference between 6.3% on average of word used metaphorically compared to 5.2% on average for healthy controls. Right? So we saw that difference in a relatively small cohort, as I was mentioned. So that's a big difference with respect to what we are doing right now, the results that we got relatively recently. So we have a larger cohort, but what's also important is that we updated significantly the methods to estimate metaphoricity, right? So it's an update on what I mentioned here, very simple feed-forward neural network. And we have something that is much more sophisticated and robust. And I invite Agrima to describe this and a few next slides. Agrima, are you on?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Sharmo. So I'll mainly be talking about the model and how we went about doing the validation. So the first thing is what we are trying to do. The problem statement is given a text. We are trying to see that whether a token or a word in the text is used metaphorically or it's used literally. Now, we cannot say anything about the word in isolation. We need to know the context around the word. We need to know the words that came before the target word and the words that came even after the target words to get the complete sense of it. So the previous study that Guillermo just spoke about was using neural networks, simple feed-forward neural networks. But we took a step ahead this time and used a bi-directional LSTM model. The reason being that textual data is sequential in nature. So whatever a word depends on what were the words that came before it. So there's always a dependence of the words, interdependence of the words between them. So we needed a model which can actually incorporate this dependency. So let's break what we see on the screen and try to understand. So we'll go bottom up. So we see that we have a sentence, office is buzzing with noise. The very first thing that we do is we convert each of these words into vectors. And in order to do that, we are using Glove. When we convert these words into vectors, we basically get the semantic of the word associated with it. Now, every word has a part of speech tag associated with the word, like office is a noun, buzzing is a verb, noise again is a noun. So we need to then take out the part of speech of each of these tokens of words. So that is the second part. And what this does is it essentially captures the syntax of it. So we have the complete information. We have the semantics as well as the syntax of the word. And we then concatenate the one-hot encoding of the pause tag along with the word embeddings. That is the third layer that you see. And this basically goes into the input to the model, which is the bidirectional LSTM. Now, this bidirectional LSTM has a forward layer and a backward layer. So the forward layer will help us identify the words, capturing the interdependency between with the current word and the words that come before it. And then we have the backward layer as well. So this helps us gain the context of the words that is coming after the target word. Now, so this these network of cells will give the output, and this output is just a bunch of numbers. This goes to the self-attention layer. Now, in order to understand self-attention, let's take an example. If I say that the cat did not cross the street because it was tired. So here the word "it" refers to the cat. But if I say that the cat did not cross the street because it was wide. So here "it" does not refers to the cat, it refers to the street. So as a human, it's easy for us to understand that when we are looking at a word, what are the other words in the sentence that is affecting this word? but how are we going to imitate the same behavior in a model? So for that, we use the self-attention layer. So with every word in context, the self-attention layer makes sure what are the other words in the sentence that needs to be emphasized or stressed upon more. So once this gets out of the self-attention layer, we then have a simple feed-forward layer, which identifies whether buzzing, when used in the context of office and noise, is metaphoric or not. Next slide, please. So we tried a lot of algorithms and then decided to go to bidirectional LSTM. The reason being the logistic regression random forests were not performing very well. And feed forward gave a little push to the F1 score, but we saw a good improvement when we went about using a context-aware bidirectional LSTM. So we see a F1 score of around 60.2 and a good precision and a recall as well. Next slide, please. As Cheryl was talking about bizarreness, with the study of Below et al., they have found out that patients with schizophrenia are using unusual metaphors or bizarre language. So how do we measure the bizarreness in language? So one way to measure this is, so there are several ways. The one which we thought of doing was look at the perplexity of the sentence. Now, to understand perplexity, we need to know what a language model is. So language model is nothing, but it just gives a probability distribution of over strings of text. So if we have a vocabulary of English language, we have a bunch of sentences. If we have like a huge corpus of sentences coming from blogs, coming from various sources, so we can basically get a probability distribution of different words. And what a language model will do is, once it's trained, given a sentence, it will give a score or a probability telling how frequently can we expect to see this text in this English language vocabulary. So let us look at this example. It says, where are we going? So the first, to calculate perplexity, we need to first calculate the probability distribution over the sentence. So we start with, what is the probability that the very first token in a sentence would be where, followed by what is the probability that if the second word in the sentence is are, the first word was where. Then we take the product with what is the probability if the third word is we, then the first two words were where, are, so on and so forth. So we basically take the entire distribution of these probabilities and we get a value. Then we take an inverse, we take an nth inverse of it. That essentially gives us the probability. N here are the total number of words. So here the value of n is going to be 4. So we are so whatever probability we get over this sentence, we are going to take an 1/4 inverse of that, and that is going to give us the perplexity value. Now the whole idea behind doing this is that if a sentence is frequently used in the vocabulary, and if it's perfectly grammatical, if it does not have any grammatical issues, then it will have a very high probability compared to the sentence which could be bizarre or is very rare, something that we don't normally use. So a high probability will come from a very well constructed sentence. An inverse of that number will give me a lower value. That means a sentence which is very well constructed will have a low perplexity, and a sentence which will have low probability will have a high perplexity. So that's how we are defining bizarreness. Next slide, please. So in order to measure bizarreness, we are making use of, okay, before we discuss that, let's look at these 3 examples. So the examples are, there is a book on the desk, there is a plane on the desk, and there is a book in the desk. So we have these 3 sample sentences. Now, out of these 3, sentence number 1 is perfectly correct. There's no issue with that. So we get the lowest perplexity for that, that is 1.54. And then it is followed by the third sentence, which says there is a book in the desk. It's grammatically incorrect. So, which is why the perplexity is increased a little. The highest perplexity of all the three sentences is there is a plane on the desk. It is perfectly correct in terms of grammar, but this is not something we usually say. So this comes as a surprise to the model, and that's why it gets a high perplexity value. Now, before we apply these, we apply this technique, we need to have a model that can capture these probabilities. So for that, we are using PyTorch transformers, and we are using GPT-2 model. And so we're using a pre-trained model, and this model is basically trained on around 40 GB of internet data. And so it's a pre-trained model, so we can directly make use of it. So the model that we have is crawling around 8 million web pages, and it's a diverse set of web pages and domains that they are crawling. And they're also making sure that they are specifically looking into the web pages which were written by humans. So that's a very well selected set of data that this model is being trained on. So we've used that model, and we have used the trained model on the transcriptions of our patients, the CHRs, the healthies, and the schizophrenia patients, and then we calculate the average perplexity of the interviews that they have. Now, in order to validate this, we had a hypothesis that a group of sentences that will be non-metaphoric in nature will have a lower perplexity compared to a group of sentences which will be metaphoric in nature. So we took 3 data sets of metaphors. So one was the Amsterdam corpus, on which we have trained our data. So they have some of the sentences where there is a word that is metaphoric, and then they have some of the sentences where none of the words are metaphoric. So we just divided them into metaphors and non-metaphors and applied a perplexity algorithm to Amsterdam corpus, to the corpus that we obtained by the work of Mohammed et al. And there's another corpus of metaphors called TROPHI. So we took these 3 to validate our task. And we saw what we hypothesized, that non-metaphors have lower perplexity compared to metaphors. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think I'm done, Kishore, so you can take over.
We can, yes. So having done all the work of building the model for what we call metaphoricity and what we call bizarreness, and as Agrima was saying, there is usually called perplexity in NLP, but for us the intention was to try to estimate this notion of bizarre language. So we apply this to the cohort that was put together by the consortium that includes Cheryl and Sinai, a group in Canada and a group in Australia. And that's, sorry, is around 170 youth at with CHR, and 60 patients, schizophrenia patients, and 126 healthy controls. And these are following an open-ended interview protocol that we've been using and Cheryl has been using for many years now, where the idea is to let the patients and the interviewees speak as freely as possible about themselves. And so it's really not a metaphor elicitation protocol. This is what is interesting. We were not asking them in any way to produce metaphors, and that was not the intention whatsoever of the method. So it's a significantly larger cohort than the one that we reported initially. And these are the results that we are getting, right? So this is a cumulative distribution function. We tend to represent the data like this because it's unlikely that the distributions are normal distributions, are good Gaussian distributions. So we prefer to represent this as this. Think of it as the integral of the histogram. So if you just integrate the histogram, this is what you see. That, for instance, the point 2 in the horizontal axis, if you look at where each curve intersects point 2, means that for the blue one, more than 90% of the samples have a value of less than 0.2, right? That's how you interpret this. And in the vertical axis, the line that goes through 0.5, that is not there, but you can imagine, is what will represent 50% of the cohort to the left and 50% to the right, and that's the median, right? So that's the median. What's represented in the vertical dashed line is the mean value. And this is the mean value of what we found to be more consistent once we correct for gender and age and for size, was to be absolutely consistent in the entire cohort. And it's not the rate that we reported in the previous paper, but the maximum metaphoricity rate percentage. That is, think about each sentence has some metaphoricity. You can compute the rate, but then you look at the extremes of that. So what we see is that when you look at the extremes over the interview, both the CHR cohort and the schizophrenia cohort have significantly higher extreme metaphoricity rates during the interview. So during the interview, they will produce sentences with a very high metaphoricity rate compared to the controls, and that's the controls is the blue line, and the orange line is schizophrenia patients, and the red line is CHR. So you get, for the cohort, for each cohort, you get a mean of 16.7% for the maximum metaphoricity rate in healthy, and 17.9, 18.5 for the CHR and schizophrenia. And the two comparisons, they have a very, very small p-value. So there's a very clear separation at the cohort level in terms of the maximum metaphoricity rate produced during the interviews. If we go to bizarreness now, what we see is something interesting, because when we compute the mean bizarreness in the way that Agrima just described, what we see is that only the schizophrenic patient population has a higher mean bizarreness, higher production of bizarre speech than both the healthy control and CHR. Right? So you get for the mean of the cohort that health is 1.76 and CHR 1.79, whereas the schizophrenic population is 1.9. Compare that with the values that we saw before, around 1.5 for that. There is a book on the desk example. And the comparisons also have very small p-values. So there's a very clear separation in terms of bizarreness between CHR and controls on one hand and schizophrenics on the other hand. And this is essentially the basic result that we have. Now, just to give you an intuition of what the algorithms are doing, these are a few examples from a healthy sample, a CHR sample and schizophrenia sample of what the algorithm finds to be metaphorical, right? So stride for relationship found to be metaphorical. Heavy in my mind is metaphorical, right? Lightheaded is metaphorical in that context. Look at the last sentence, HR, and it's a way to vent that's also considered metaphorical according to this procedure. And like I said, as you saw, we don't have a perfect way of mapping with our algorithm identifying what human raters found in the corpus to be metaphorical. But what is true is that there is no bias here. We're not biasing toward the CHR or schizophrenia. So imperfect as the algorithm might be at identifying what human raters found to be metaphorical, is not biased, right? So this gives you an idea of what is that this metaphoricity algorithm is doing in trying to replicate the metaphor identification procedure. And this is an example also for what we are computing in terms of bizarreness, right? So this is a paragraph that is highly bizarre as an example. This is a CHR example. And you can see the first sentence, no, you are in the painting, you are in the painting. And it comes back to, very bizarre use of language that maybe in the larger context might be less bizarre, but at least in the way we are estimating bizarreness now, this is a very good example of a highly bizarre or perplexed, we would say in NLP, language production. The other thing that our results show, and again, just looking at the basic result from increased metaphoricity production in CHR and schizophrenia and increased bizarreness in schizophrenia, we find that if you ask the question, is there any correlation between our measure of metaphoricity and our measure of bizarreness, right? So is there any bias that maybe what we call metaphoricity is actually bizarreness, or vice versa? What we see is that that's not the case at all for the healthy cohorts, right? So you have in the scatter plot the bizarreness and metaphoricity values, and also the variance that is explained by the correlation, and is really is negligible for the healthy population. It's negligible for the CHR population, but it's significant. Is really significant. So the variance of almost 20% in the schizophrenic population. So essentially, one way to think about this is that bizarreness accounts for about 20% of the variance in metaphoricity in the schizophrenia population. And this to the question, we don't know this, but it poses the question that bizarreness may be accounting for unconventional metaphoricity in the schizophrenia population, right? So we have no answer to that. It raises this question. So I think that, I don't know, Cheryl or Agrima, if you want to talk about this.
Agrima, it's your data.
Sure. So we looked at metaphoricity and its like how is it basically different in gender, and how is bizarreness different in gender. So we did see that males are using more metaphors compared to females, and it was statistically significant, but we did not see any such group difference when it comes to bizarreness. Next slide, please. For correlation, so this we looked at the correlation of age with metaphors and age with bizarreness, and we did not really find anything. Now, this is interesting because we looked at the role function and the social function with respect to metaphors and with respect to bizarreness. So with respect to metaphors, we did see a negative correlation. So people who are using more metaphors are scoring low on role function. And the same applies with the social function as well. Next slide. Yeah.
Right. So I think we can stop here and try to summarize what we presented, and also invite Agrima and Cheryl to say more. But in principle, I mean, this is which I try to match colors to maturity or difficulty, but Agrima and Cheryl didn't like my color convention because, of course, you know, what do I know? But essentially, you know, we were able to validate the earlier study in a much smaller cohort from one side in terms of confirming the increased production of metaphoric content in CHR and schizophrenia. We found, which we didn't look for it the first time, we found also clearly increased bizarre speech in schizophrenia. Now, the next steps that are relatively straightforward once we have the data is a more precise, a more clear analysis of how these metrics correlate with clinical scores. And we just saw some of it with global function. And importantly, the relationship to conversion, which we still don't have in this cohort, but eventually we will. Then the next steps are much more involved, and we need to think quite a bit about that. And I mentioned already that the basic algorithm cannot distinguish between conventional and unconventional metaphors and/or bizarre metaphors. And this is something that we need to think about how to estimate. It's important other direction is given in particular the protocol of the interviews that we've been studying, whether we can establish any particular relationship between increased or decreased metaphoricity in relation to the self. Are they more metaphorical or less metaphorical when they speak about themselves and they speak about others, or they speak about events, right? There is as Cheryl mentioned in the work of Britta, there's a possible connection with sentiment, what's called sentiment balance. So if there is emotional load, does that affect metaphoricity or bizarreness production? There is even more challenging yet, and that is, do we need to consider higher order structures of metaphoricity? So should we look at paragraph as metaphoric, you know, longer structures in the text as being metaphoric? Again, that's something that we know it does exist in literature. It's not clear that it will have a relevance in this type of interviews, but it might. And then even farther beyond in terms of difficulty and conceptually and even more algorithmically, can we account for other forms of figurative speech? Not just this specific way of thinking about metaphors. And can we think about addressing the issue of what I call metaphor aptness, right? And by that I mean, if I write a metaphor and I show it to you, and I take a metaphor from my fellow countryman Jorge Luis Borges, you will immediately see the difference. And we have no idea how to do that algorithmically, right? So we, as humans, we can recognize that immediately, that our algorithms have no clue as to what is in a good metaphor, in a meaningful metaphor, and in an apt metaphor, as opposed to one that is, trivial, or it's not just conventional. It's not a good metaphor. And I would stop here, unless Agrima or Sherry, you want to say something more specific, and we can start with the discussion.
I think we could start with the discussion. I think that Natalia will lead, and I just wanted to point out that there were 2 comments and questions in the chat. And I want to thank you, Guillermo, and also Agrima, for nice presentation of the study and methods and data.
Thanks for that, all of you. It's a great example of how computational linguistics can, the power of computational linguistics to understand some complex concepts like bizarreness and metaphoricity. So I will let Natalia to lead the discussion, and then we'll come back and attend to the questions and the chat box after Natalia's talk.
Really nice talk. Thank you very much for this, this inspiration. I will share my screen with you just to present a few slides. It's like a proposition of what we could discuss in the light of what we heard about metaphors. So metaphors and mental health has a lot of things to do in it. It has been described by different positions, but there is this link that we are used to express ourselves and our mental inner space, feelings using metaphors all the time. So happy is up, sad is down. It's something that carries the sense of what we feel. And it's very, this notion of metaphors and psychopathology has a long history in the literature. And since the 30s, I could find this paper. It's about, it's on JAMA, and it already explains this this idea that our affective states and intellectual process can be expressed by metaphors, and how this actually mirrors what is going on in our minds. So, and it also has this developmental steps and during typical development, and always also link it to a variety of psychological and cognitive aspects of cultural development. So during the development, it seems to be a slow developmental trajectory until the early adolescence to actually be stable in terms of comprehension and production of metaphors. So it has a lot of time to have some cultural aspects influencing this developmental aspects of metaphor comprehension and production. So my question is inspired by this paper from Lena Palaniapan, a recent paper calling this sense that language could be bio, but also a social marker, and at this lens of how could culture influence this metaphor development, I would let this questions to the audience and also to the speakers. So how can we talk about cultural aspects of metaphors and how this could influence our way to look at it during computational developments as we saw presented today. So a question is, how influential is, for example, the corpus, the basis corpus, use it to train the machine learning algorithms to understand the metaphorical relationships, for example? How can we add this knowledge of cultural diversity into that talk? And also, how could we see some opportunities here in this network, collecting data from different sites and different cultural perspectives, and how can we advance here in this knowledge?
That's great. Thanks for that nice summary, Natalia. There are a lot of questions. We have another 35 to 40 minutes. So without much more ado, I will start reading out the questions and the order that came up in the chat box. The first question is from Peter Little. Peter, do you want to come online, or shall I read the question out?
Well, thanks. I'm happy to read it, I guess, myself. I'm interested, but, well, first of all, thanks very much for a great presentation. With regard to, well, bizarreness, which emerges clearly as something that is important, it's related to function and indeed has other importance as well. But as Agrima described her method for quantifying it, it appeared to me that estimate of bizarreness really depends on the frequency with which these expressions are used. And I'm struck by the fact that the expressions that poets use are infrequent. The quality of mercy is not strained, was said by one quite famous poet. And that you probably won't find if you do any sort of estimate of the likelihood that everyday speech would produce that. You'd find that was unusual. So I guess, well, my question really is there a bizarreness that is pathological, that is associated with disorder, compared to a bizarreness that is associated with being an unusual thinker who finds interesting ways of using words?
Let me give one answer, and the answer is, well, we don't, the same way that we capture a very constrained understanding of metaphors, we capture a very constrained understanding of bizarreness. So yes, we don't have a way at the moment of separating bizarre and as strange, or bizarre as original. All right. The algorithm cannot address that, and
sure.
Algorithmically, we need to think hard about how to capture that. But the short answer is that's the extent of what we can measure at the moment, and originality is not part of the equation. And I have a group in the lab, not in my lab, but in IBM Research, is working on creativity, computational creativity, and we are still very, very, very far from anything that is meaningful at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. It's a challenge, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, if any no more comments on that, I'll call Sunny Tang. Sunny has a question following this.
Thanks, Lena, and many thanks to all the speakers for the fantastic talk. I was wondering if you had any theories for what's going on in the transition from clinical high risk to schizophrenia that could account for the difference in the relationship between metaphoricity and bizarreness that's appearing in schizophrenia but isn't present in CHR.
Maybe I'll take this one. So this is a cross-sectional study, and CHR, clinical high risk for psychosis, is very heterogeneous. And so we haven't looked at the association of bizarreness in CHR with other features that might be predictive of who is in an early stage of schizophrenia. I think it might be that those individuals who are CHR who later go on to develop schizophrenia may have elevated bizarreness compared to those who don't. It's an empirical question. We're following up on the cohort in Melbourne. So I don't think we can say much about transition yet. And I think the finding of increased bizarreness in schizophrenia is consistent with the literature. What to make of CHR also having increased metaphoricity, we're kind of wrapping our heads around, I think. Would you, yes, Guillermo?
Yeah, I want to
disagree.
Yeah, I want to banter a bit, and yes, and in relation to your presentation of Cooper-Beck's idea, an alternative, and I mentioned this because I also work in other conditions, not just clinical high risk and schizophrenia. Another way of thinking about this is that, well, if your experience, your cognitive, emotional, daily experience, the way you experience your life is not normative, when you describe it, because, going back to Nietzsche, all we do is produce metaphors when we speak. Then to describe, if I take peyote, right, and then I had to describe what happened to me, I will use very unusual metaphor for someone who never took peyote, right? So, and it might be that it's just you're describing a human experience that is unusual because you have something that few people, comparatively speaking, experience. And then there's no other way to express that and explain what's going on with you, but to use metaphors that will, but naturally will be unusual, and you will need to produce more metaphors because there is no normative language to explain what's going on with you. And I think this might be the case in the type of protocol that you use, Cheryl, right? So, and that may explain why there is a dependency with the protocol, right? Because maybe this protocol, it will expose this more clearly than other protocols. That's my petty theory.
I think, yes, no, I think that definitely makes sense. I was just thinking that it would be very neat if there could be another, really incremental, this progressive explanation where ideas and concepts might be kind of losing their cohesion or losing the normative associations as people progress through clinical high risk and develop schizophrenia, such that when you're at the intermediate clinical high risk stage, they loosen just a little bit such that you're picking it up as metaphors. But then as they dissolve further, then you're starting to pick it up as perplexity and bizarreness.
I think that's a wonderful model. And again, we'll hopefully be able to test it empirically by following up the CHR, who will also have repeat interviews and language analysis. So I think that's a great point. I just wanted to say very quickly, because I don't think we covered it, the way that we elicited speech is really quite open-ended, and it's using qualitative research methods that Larry Davidson at Yale has developed. And it really starts out with just asking people, how are you doing? And then it's kind of off to the races, and we follow them wherever they go. Now, the downside of that is that that's unstructured. Trust me, I get critiqued on that all the time in papers and grants. But on the other hand, we really give people the opportunity, people are talking about themselves, and we've had qualitative research papers come out of this, which are also interesting thematically, different ways that people talk about identity and who they are and how they've changed, et cetera. So that's just the way that we elicit the data.
Gina has a comment. I just want to say,
Great.
The clinical high risk, the way we examine clinical high risk, the way we construct it, most people do not develop schizophrenia. So that's something
right.
to keep in mind as well over time. So Gina, can you join in?
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see familiar names out there, like people like Brita, who I haven't seen for years, and it's very nice. Yeah, and thanks, Lena, for everything you've done to sort of organize all of this. And thanks for really cool, interesting talk, both of you. I guess I've got lots of sort of thoughts, but one of them, I do want to say, I really don't think that any kind of the kind of generative, sort of probabilistic predictive framework that we've been sort of talking about both in healthy adults as well as in and how it might go awry in psychopathology. I mean, it very much, I don't think of them that as being sort of completely conflicting in any way with, with your comments. Let me do the guitar thing, but yes, Guillermo. And the reason is that, I mean, as I'm sure that you guys are all very much in agreement, the mind is the brain and the brain is the mind. We live in an environment. And so remember that in any probabilistic framework, you're not just talking about comprehension and inference in the brain, you're also talking about lifelong learning. And so you can, to Sunny's comment, you can absolutely see, a system whereby the more bizarre your life experiences over time, over time would translate into not only inappropriate bottom-up prediction error, for example, or inappropriate lexicosemantic activity within the brain, during an acute phase of psychosis, but also that itself would end up modulating pathways such that might lead to longer-term implications. So I really don't think of those two things as being opposed. Having said that, I also think it's a very open question about whether metaphor is sort of triggered by the lexicosemantics of individual words, and we would need to really look at, develop theories, much more sophisticated theories than I've ever sort of put across to be able to translate that onto how, people might produce what we understand as metaphors. I really like, Natalia, your emphasis on socioeconomic and cultural background. I just think that's something that we as a field have really ignored over the years, and it's just so important, particularly, well, I'm talking in the US, there's, really been a reckoning that, that we've sort of ignored so many segments of the population. And so I love that this consortium is international. But with that in mind, I think it would be really important to, I recognize that the whole aim here is to computerize and to be able to pick out algorithms that are automated. And I definitely recognize the idea that, this is unbiased. So what you're seeing across groups, if there are problems with the algorithm, then, that wouldn't be systematically affecting individual groups. But I do think it would be really important to have people from, to sort of individually rate the actual, even though it's so time consuming, and I realize, the actual productions that people are producing and comparing them, and ideally people from the same socioeconomic and cultural environment that the people sort of produce, of the people that actually produce the speech. And I think that could also lead to really interesting insights. And of course, sort of all these these algorithms, yeah, it's really nicely acknowledged, they're really imperfect. And you're picking up many things other than what we understand as metaphor in them. And there's going to be a lot of overlap in constructs. So yeah, those are my sort of main thoughts and comments. I just think it's wonderful that you're doing this. I was actually really interested in your quantification of, sorry, I won't speak for too long, but I actually really interested in your computation of bizarreness, like basically using predictability. That's something we're really interested in doing. We're doing it in a slightly different way to you, where I really know you were sort of collapsing across the whole sentence, whereas we're looking literally at every single word as speech unfolds in real time. Yeah, with a sort of different emphasis, but I really think that's going to be a really important way to go in quantifying yeah, what we call bizarreness, or just quantifying speech, not only in psychosis, but in many populations. We know just from healthy adults that both comprehension and production, far, far, far more than we ever realized before, is hugely dependent. I mean, you can explain so much, almost all variants through predictability. I mean, that's just a simple measure that we now have access to using these really sophisticated language models. And that, to my mind, is absolutely the way to go, to be able to quantify any, yeah, basically any communicative speech, both in production as well as in comprehension. And so I was excited to see you're using those measures too, and also interestingly in a different way, you're collapsing across sentences rather than kind of really doing it sort of incrementally. And so it would be really interesting to compare and contrast those different ways of using predictability measures.
Thanks, Gina.
So those are my thoughts.
Thanks for that nice summary, Gina. It's a lot of concepts you brought in together. It'll take some time for all of us to reflect and work on many, many things that are all, interesting. Just one thought came to my mind. We talk about immigration as a second most risk factor after genetics and obstetric complications for psychosis. Being an immigrant, I remember when I first moved to Britain, it took me a lot of time to understand the difference, metaphorical difference between what is back and what is backside. I always made that mistake. So just to make an example of how social factors are not easy to immediately understand. I'm going to call in Visar Berisha from Arizona State University. Could you all please, if you don't mind, briefly introduce yourself and your work, because we have very diverse membership. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Visar Berisha, I'm a faculty in the College of Health Solutions at Arizona State and also in electrical engineering. So my work is actually in clinical speech analytics for different conditions, including various thought disorders. It's really great to see this work moving forward. And my question is sort of comes from an internal struggle that I have myself when I do this work, in the sense that you have these very difficult to define constructs like metaphoricity and bizarreness that have perhaps been operationally defined manually in the past using a specific set of rules that have been individually validated. And once you move to the computational domain, you run the risk, especially when the algorithms are constructed in a purely data-driven way, of assigning names like metaphoricity and bizarreness to sequences of computational steps that may not be that, right? They may be something else. So I'm just would love to pick your brain about what are the risks associated with that. Does that is that of concern? And I'll pause there and would love to get your comments.
Let me start with an answer. And this is this is what I said throughout, that this is a limited, constrained understanding of what metaphoricity is, of what bizarreness is, and at the end of the day, they are not other than codifying something that we put together, right? So we started with the metaphor identification process that is done by individuals, and it's codified in a particular way. We're just trying to capture that in numbers, and the risk is to confuse the algorithmic output with the real thing. But that's the real risk. We know that this is a limitation, but it's a limitation not just of the algorithm, it's our own limitation of coming up with, I don't like to use the word objective, but with procedures that we all agree upon. Right? When you provide the clinical score, the SIPs and the SOPs, you have the same problem, right? So what is objective? How do we make sure that we are addressing the same thing and that is universally translatable? Algorithmically, that's not much of a difference, right? We are facing the same problem. I think the risk is to forget that this is an approximation, right? So we know this is an approximation, and we know that we have to develop better models. But for me, that's the risk. Just forget that you are confusing your analytics with the ground truth. It will always be an approximation.
I guess it's not the approximation part that is concerning. So with existing, say, functional skills, you can reason about what questions to ask, and you can ask patients what's important and what's not. With something like an objective measure of metaphoricity, well, I'll use so you don't know internally what the algorithm is doing. So for example, one of the outcomes of building a model to detect metaphoricity using these existing corpora is that you get a better measure than perplexity for measuring bizarreness, right? Because one of the differences between a metaphor and something that's not a metaphor is, one group is more bizarre, I'm using that in quotes, than the other, in terms of how typical the output is. Demolished versus attorneys in courtroom. So the question isn't so much whether it's an approximation or not, it's whether, if you're interpreting now the output of this model as metaphoricity, but it's really just a more sensitive measure of bizarreness, does that have downstream consequences?
Well, okay, so one answer to that is that we have ways of interpreting the models, right? And I work with a group in the lab that is called Interpretable AI, that they are working very hard to open the hood and trying to make sense of what's inside these models. And it is not easy, but it can be done. So I think it's along the same lines of not confusing your algorithmic output with what the ground truth might be. You have to challenge all the time, your models, right? And again, many people use these black boxes, but there is a big push towards what's called, again, interpretable AI, and being able to use, now people use GANs to probe and see that your models is working as intended. So I think that risk is addressable to some extent, right? And there is growing awareness that this has to be done.
So can I just ask one, or I'll end with a final comment. I promise this will be my last. I just want to get the group's take on this. Do you think it would be beneficial to focus? So right now you have these measures that you put within a model, for example, to detect or to classify between risk groups, I suppose. Is there any benefit to sort of elementally validating each of these outputs with respect to large relevant corpora? I think the previous speaker, or the previous question sort of referred to this as well. And if so, how do we scale that process? I think that's sort of really would move the field forward.
Well, I don't have an answer to this question. I think Gina is having some thoughts on it, and Cheryl might also have something to add to this. Gina?
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of very clear thoughts on sort of the role of computational models and its relationship to sort of understanding psychosis. And I think there are three different fields, and they can or cannot interface, and they each have validity and importance in of their own right. So, clinical rating scales is the only method that we actually had for so many years to be able to quantify the productions of people with schizophrenia. And as I was trained as a psychiatrist, in the tradition of wonderful people like Peter Little and Pete McKenna and Lena, actually, in true British psychiatry sort of tradition, and also American, there's this huge emphasis on phenomenology and thought disorder, right? So thought disorder is the quintessential disorganized, and what we heard in this talk, bizarre speech. And then you have these ways of subdividing thought disorder, but they're purely descriptive, okay? And in my earlier years of research, I thought, oh, let's look at thought disorder and separate them from non-thought disordered people. But, we communicate through language, and there's got to be a continuum. And so, I think there's going to be overlap, but it's not going to be exactly there, as you nicely put it. There is no ground truth. And so what you're seeking to do when you're looking at, and so why do we assess thought disorder? Sorry, I was very tangential there myself, but why do we assess thought disorder? For prognosis, for markers, for predictors, for all the reasons that we assess any clinical scale. And so exactly the same reasons why you want to develop good computational models. Of course, you need to look at the relationship between them. And ideally, there will be a clear overlap between them. But it's highly likely that our computational models are also going to capture variance that is not so obvious to a clinician or even a well-trained researcher who's trying to quantify the bizarreness of someone's speech. It's going to, basically, in an ideal world, capture more variance. So we're really sort of probing in the dark here. But as for then trying to say, oh, the way these models are actually outputting their these classifications, the way that we're actually quantifying these models has anything to do with the human brain. No one believes that. It just doesn't. Beyond picking up on statistical regularities and doing some sort of fancy things with those and beyond those really basic computational constructs, there's no way that even the most sophisticated measures of like things like GPT-2 and GPT-3, they had nothing to do with, what we know about how the human brain is organized. And so I'm really skeptical about looking into the guts of these computational models and pretending that we can say anything about mechanism. But what we can do is use them because they work really well. Basically use their outputs as ways of reaching out and establishing validity and looking at what we consider important as prognostic and diagnostic indicators that we're so far been really dependent on using much coarser-grained clinical rating scales. But I think, I was very happy to hear that you have clinical rating scales of all these measures and you plan to look at them. And that will be really, really important. And I'm sure they're going to overlap, but they're also going to explain variance that isn't explained by those scales. And that's a good thing.
Well, there's quite a lot of discussion coming up, and this can go on for the whole day. I think this is very interesting. I feel bad to cut this all short, but we have 3 or 4 questions queuing up. So we're going to have Brian McQueenie, and then Alberto Parola, and then Rohit Volati. We'll start with you, Brian.
Yeah, actually, Guillermo really addressed my question when he talked earlier about the nature of the protocol. I would have serious doubts that if you have picture description as your protocol, rather than tell me about yourself, that you're going to get the same results. I think that's pretty obvious. I was thinking about people who have to describe pain. They use very highly metaphorical terms. But really, I want to put in one other thing, if you don't mind, while I have the floor. I really would think it'd be great to use all the perplexity, and I think underneath some of this, you were also using things like word sketches. Those are the things that, why is it that you demolish an argument? So, you can, so we spent 2 years on a big IARPA project comparing Farsi, Russian, Mexican, Spanish, Chinese, English, for metaphors, right? Using conceptual metaphor theory. And there were enormous cultural, everybody has metaphors that express everything, but the extent to which they focus on certain areas are very different. So cultural differences are important, but what we really found was that everything is so idiomatic, really formulaic. So I think it would be really nice to be able to pull out the perplexity, pull out the formulaticity, and finally get down to those metaphors that are really expressive and unique and remarkable in a corpus. So somehow use these mathematical, whether it's bird or glove, or perplexity, and pull away all those other sheds of stuff that we don't care about, and get right down targeted to those metaphors that are really kind of unique. And boy, would that be interesting. Okay.
Agreed.
I love that, Brian.
Yeah. Well, so we take some work, to say the least.
And just what you've said about pain, I know we have to move on, but if you want to contact Guillermo offline, he has done a huge amount of work on NLP in pain.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the discussion, Brian. We have Alberto Parola from Italy.
Thank you very much, Lina, and thank you very much for the great talk. Brief introduction, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Aarhus University, and I also work in University of Turin. My background is in psychology. I'm a psychologist and with a PhD in neuroscience, and now actually I'm working on a Marie Curie project focused on studying vocal acoustic pattern and also semantic pattern in schizophrenia, adopting a cross-linguistic perspective. So I'm very interested in the DISCOURSE initiative because it's very close to the focus of my project. And my question is really related to what Gina has already said, and also to the intervention of Sunny, because I'm especially interested in the mechanism. So the question is, do you have any more specific idea on the mechanism responsible for the higher metaphoricity and bizarreness rates in the group of patients and in the group of individuals at high clinical risk? Do you think it may be related to bottom-up processes? For example, you mentioned the incongruous semantic activation, or maybe also related to top-down mechanisms, for example, to the social contextual demands. And if you also have any idea on how to test in future studies or also in your corpus on how to test hypotheses on mechanisms, because this may be really relevant in a clinical perspective.
Well, I had included a slide describing Gina's work that hopefully was accurate. And I know, Gina, you had just said that you think that these algorithms might be limited in terms of study of mechanisms. So I'm a little bit cowed, to be honest.
Sorry, no, I really didn't mean it like that. We're absolutely using these algorithms to study mechanisms. I meant neural. I meant looking at the model to understand them. But I did not.
Let me take myself out of it, because actually, to me, I'm very happy that you're here and you have done this very careful work, and I think can be really key and informative about how to take these kinds of descriptive findings that we have and then operationalize it in terms of a way to look at mechanisms in respect, especially I think to physiology, which is, I think is the way to go. With the different NLP features that we have, we don't have such a large cohort. We've looked at correlations of coherence with brain structure and resting connectivity. We published on that, and this whole language circuit. For electrophysiology, we're finding some associations, though they're not clear, between auditory processing and some of the NLP features that we're looking at. We're interested in looking at resting state, but we haven't done the kind of careful paradigms that you've done. I think it would be useful to have studies where we do both. And if you can think of a way that we can operationalize, sort of metaphor. I know that you have studies with comprehension or even language production where you're recording, I believe, N400s, and it's very nice work showing that that kind of modulation is off in schizophrenia. Anyway, so I'm kind of taking advantage of your being here to help us to answer that question. And Guillermo has his hand up too.
Let me add, just to answer Alberto to some extent. There are, in terms of mechanisms, yes, and I agree with Sherry and with Gina. It's difficult to jump from what we can do with NLP to brain mechanisms, but you can test hypotheses. And I mentioned earlier my idea that maybe it's just the condition of being a patient and having, non-normative experiences in your life. And Brian mentioned about pain. We've seen this. We measure, metaphoricity in pain, and it's increased when they are talking about their pain, but not when they are talking about something else. So that's something that is relatively easy, straightforward to do here as well. Is metaphoricity related to the self or not to the self? It's related to, the fact that emotions are triggered or is independent of emotion. There are many, many hypotheses regarding the mechanism that you can test on language, right? And it's not, it will not uncover mechanism, but at least you can validate or refute a number of hypotheses.
I just want to speak up here because I think that what I said was completely misleading to some people. The word mechanism can mean many different things. When you're thinking about testing cognitive models, then we need dependent measures. And getting a really good dependent measure from the output of a sophisticated computational model is really valuable in testing cognitive and neurocognitive mechanism. What I meant was, if you're then looking at that computational model and figuring out, for example, how it works to generate those dependent measures, for example, the precise relationship between bottom-up and top-down feedback within the model, and using that to make generalizations about the brain, then that's all I meant. We ourselves are following in the footsteps of you guys, Tori, who's a wonderful graduate student of mine, and I can see here, so I just want to give her a shout out. We're working with Lena and with Eric to do precisely what you're trying to do. So I really didn't want to I'm sorry if I came dismissive in saying that computational models can tell us nothing about mechanism. That is not what I meant. I was talking to a very specific way of understanding a particular aspect of brain architecture. So I just want to make that clear.
Well, I feel bad we're not in person meeting and discussing all these things. We're all in Zoom doing this. It'll be much more lively in person. But anyway, I'm looking at the clock. We're running out of time. This is a very interesting discussion. I want to just pass a closing remark, following up on what Cheryl, Guillermo, and Agrima and everyone else discussing here has brought up. I think there's going to be a tension between explanation and prediction. What explains may not predict. What predicts may not explain. But both of them are two rails of the railroad, and we need both. We really need to predict the prognosis and diagnosis in our clinical groups, and we don't have any to do that at the moment. We are very poor in that regard, so we have to move forward. And Cheryl's work and Guillermo's work is taking us in that direction. And I'm very pleased we had a chance to discuss that. And number two, just prediction is not going to be very helpful. If we predict something and we cannot do something about it, a car is coming to hit me, but I cannot do anything. It's not very helpful. We really need to understand the mechanisms in order to attack them and start thinking about treatment options. So in my mind, this tension is quite artificial. I think we had to travel together, even though I would like to see much more lively flying of papers in person if people are in the same room. With that comment, I want to close by thanking everyone for being here. Again, it's not easy to keep 60 people together for 2 hours in this time and age. So thanks everyone, and thanks Natalia for leading a very nice discussion. We have more talks coming in the series. Again, I say last Friday of every month, except November and December. That means it'll be last Friday of October. We'll meet here and we'll have same room, same password, and we'll have a very interesting talk on, I think it's neuroimaging next time, if I remember correctly. Well, that went out of my screen, but I will send you an email about what exactly next month's talk is. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So I will close the recording and